once worked with a guy who had no idea where his prostate was. He was in his early 50s, successful, well-educated, perfectly capable of navigating the world. But when it came to his body, specifically what was happening below the belt, he was completely lost. He didn't know where his prostate was located. And when I suggested that he might benefit from exploring a little bit, getting familiar with his own physical terrain, what was happening when he got aroused, he looked at me as if I asked him to speak a foreign language on the spot. He was apprehensive, and it wasn't because he was prudish. It was just because no one had ever told him that this stuff mattered. He had no concept of his anatomy or sex for that matter. To him, it was just penis goes in vagina. And I would love to say that he was the exception, but he's kind of the rule. Especially here in America, where sex education is completely inadequate. Most of us got some version of this is what happens during puberty. And maybe we got some diagram on reproductive organs or something, but understanding how the body actually works, like how arousal happens, what's going on when you get hard, that was not really part of the curriculum. And even if you took biology or physiology in high school, most of us didn't get those courses. I mean, I did, but a lot of us didn't. And high school level biology, of course, is usually not very detailed enough to really understand the mechanics of your own sexual function. And even if you did, sometimes we forget what we learned if we're not in the field of medicine or if we just aren't particularly curious or super interested in those things. And even if you did pursue higher education, that does not guarantee that you learned any of this. And even if you did learn it at some point, you might not have learned it in like general practical terms, like the kind of language that actually helps you to understand what's happening in your body in general or during sex. So when something stops functioning the way that it used to, for example, maybe you can't get hard or you can't stay hard, you don't even have the vocabulary to understand what's happening, let alone talk about it with someone else. So this week we're getting into the mechanics, not because I want to bore you with a biology lesson. The purpose of this episode is to give you a high-level overview of the anatomy of a penis owner, just so that you have some context to apply to the experience. Understanding what's happening when your penis gets hard and what's happening when it doesn't can definitely take some of the shame and confusion out of the experience. So let's get into it. We're going to start with the basics. So what is an erection? An erection, in biological terms, is blood trapped in the penis under pressure. That's it. That's what's happening under the hood when you get hard. The penis gets engorged with blood. The blood gets trapped. The pressure makes it firm. And when the blood drains out, the penis goes soft. It's really that simple. Well, it's not that simple, actually, because for that blood to flow in and stay there, there's a bunch of systems in the body that have to work together. Your cardiovascular system, your nervous system, your hormones, your brain, all of that has to be functioning and communicating. If one part of the system breaks down, erections become unreliable. So let's talk about what's happening when everything is working first. So it starts in the brain. Arousal is mental first, physical second, at least when you're awake. Well, maybe when you're asleep too, because even if you're having a sexy dream, that's still a mental thing. So let's just go with that. Arousal is mental first and physical second. So when you're turned on, your brain sends a signal down your spinal cord through the pudendal nerves. And that's Pudendal nerves to your penis. Those signals trigger the release of nitric oxide, which tells the arteries in your penis to relax and open up. So then blood rushes in and fills two chambers in the penis that are called the corpora cavernosa. Think of them like two cylinders running the length of the shaft. So as those two chambers fill up with blood, They expand and press against the veins that normally drain blood out of the penis. And when those veins get compressed, the blood can't leave. Then there's also a layer of tissue called the tunica albuginea. This will be in the show notes so you don't have to remember. That wraps around these chambers. And when the chambers are filled up with blood, that tissue stretches tight, which helps trap the blood inside. So then that trapped blood is under pressure, and that's what makes the cock hard. So you see, getting hard is this coordinated effort, the brains, the nerves, the blood vessels, the tissues, all of it working together. Now, here's the thing that you might not realize. Arousal starts in the brain, not the cock. So you see something, you think about that something, then you feel something that turns you on. That's your brain processing desire. So again, your brain is sending these signals to your body that says, okay, let's get it on. Let's turn it on. Let's turn on the lights, right? And if your brain isn't in the game, sometimes your body can't respond. Now, I've said this before ad nauseum. Sometimes arousal is just the response to stimulation. So it doesn't always mean that something feels good. Your body can respond to stimuli without conscious desire. We're not going to get into that, but that's the truth. But because it starts in the brain first, that's why you can be physically healthy. You could have a good vascular system. You could be completely diabetes free with great testosterone levels, and you can still struggle with erections. Because if your mind isn't turned on, if you're stressed or anxious or distracted, your body won't cooperate the way that it should. Case in point, I once dated a guy who was completely convinced that he was going to have ED for the rest of his life. He had been married for 25 years, and for the last 10 of those years, he could not get hard. I mean, consistently. He tried everything, supplements, medications, diet, exercise, all of it. Nothing helped. So he was just kind of resigned to the idea that this was just how his body was now and that his sex life was over. And then he got divorced. A few months after the divorce, he started dating again, and he was shocked to discover that his erections came back. It was like a light switch had been flipped on because his ED wasn't physiological. It was completely psychological. 10 years of a dying marriage, 10 years of resentment and disconnection and stress, and his body had been responding to that the whole time. He just didn't realize it until his situation changed. He is not alone, though. A lot of men experience this. ED can feel permanent. It feels like a physical failure, but sometimes it's just the nervous system responding to the chaos of chronic stress and anxiety or being in a relationship that makes them feel miserable. But this is where it gets complicated because sometimes it might start off as psychological and then become physiological. I have also worked with men who started with a psychological ED, performance anxiety, relationship stress, or whatever. And over time, it progressed into physical ED. The stress and anxiety made them avoid sex, and then the lack of sex meant that there was less blood flow to the penis, the tissues weren't being used, all that inner piping that we talked about earlier started to deteriorate, and there wasn't regular blood flow. So now what started off as something that was going on emotionally or psychologically created a physical problem. I said all that to say that erectile dysfunction is rarely just one thing. Oh, I really hate the term erectile dysfunction. But anyways, I know I said that before, but it's almost never just one thing. Sometimes it's psychological, sometimes it's physical, sometimes it's both. It can also be situational. Maybe you have no trouble getting an erection with one partner and can't get an inkling of a rise with another. It can be circumstantial, stress at work, health issues, lifing. It can also be seasonal. Some people struggle achieving and maintaining erections in wintertime because it's colder, and some people are impacted emotionally by the change in the weather. And, there can be stress and anxiety and a little bit of depression at certain times of the year. And sometimes there's just no clear pattern that you can identify. So trying to figure out what's in your head or in your body might be the wrong question. Sometimes you just don't need to dig into the why. If you can't figure it out, that can just be an added layer of stress. So this is not an invitation to stress yourself out about what's going on. If you know, you know, but if you haven't been able to figure it out, that's still okay. Now let's switch gears a little bit and talk about the nervous system. So the nervous system has two modes, parasympathetic and sympathetic, or as you might have heard them, one is the rest and digest, and the other one is fight or flight. So the parasympathetic nervous system, the rest and digest side, is what allows blood to flow into the cock. You're feeling safe, relaxed, turned on, and your body just opens up like a flower. Blood flows in, you get hard. The sympathetic nervous system, or the fight or flight, shuts that down completely. So you're stressed, you're anxious, you're scared, and your body redirects blood away from the penis to your muscles, to vital organs, because in fight or flight mode, survival matters more than sex. Now, there is a caveat, because there are some people who, when they are anxious and stressed, experience heightened states of arousal. That's a conversation for another day. Okay, so here's something that gets tricky. Worrying about whether or not you can achieve an erection can activate the sympathetic nervous system. So it can activate that fight or flight. So say you're lying in bed with your partner, you're thinking, please work, please get hard. So now your body is interpreting that anxiety as danger, which means your nervous system is shutting down the very thing you're hoping will happen. So maybe the first time your penis doesn't respond, you brush it off. The second time, you might start worrying. The third time, you're anxious before sex even gets started. And now every time sex might happen, you're thinking, is this going to work this time? And that anxiety keeps you from getting hard, which reinforces the anxiety. And now you're stuck in a loop. So in other words, your mind can create an ED situation even when there's nothing else going on physically. However, you can also train your body how to respond by ruminating about whether you can get hard or not. And you can also train your body to respond by doing physical things. So there are men who spent years masturbating, hard grip, rapid speed, porn, and your body can get used to a certain type of stimulation. It can learn to respond to that kind of stimulation and only that. I have seen this a lot, where men masturbate so much that the only way they can really get off is by doing that. And then they struggle to maintain an erection with a partner because, again, the stimulation is completely different. It might be softer and slower and wetter or whatever. And the penis won't respond the same way because he gets used to being touched in a certain way. And it isn't because there's something wrong with the partner. It isn't because you don't like the sex you're having. It's just simply that the body is now conditioned to respond to a specific type of sensation. Sometimes that's the death grip, right? Death grip syndrome is real. Gripping too hard during masturbation can train your body to need that intense pressure to get aroused. So the nerves essentially become desensitized in the penis, and porn can create unrealistic expectations around what sex looks like, what body looks like, what arousal should feel like. So again, your penis might work fine alone, but it might not come online with a partner. And there is no shame in talking about this. So please don't misunderstand. I am just merely painting a picture of how a body can be taught to respond to one thing and the challenges of trying to teach it something else. So understanding that your brain and body are connected, what you think about, what you're anxious about, how you've conditioned yourself to respond, all of that affects erection. So now let's talk about the physical stuff that can interfere with erection. So there's that. but there's also physical things that can get in the way. So, for example, the cardiovascular system. The cardiovascular system needs to be functioning well for blood to flow into the penis. So if you have high blood pressure, clogged arteries, poor circulation, then blood can't get where it needs to go. And your cock needs blood flow in the same way that your heart and brain do. So there's like arteriosclerosis going on. Getting an erection becomes difficult. And in fact, erectile dysfunction is one of the warning signs of cardiovascular disease. Not always, but for some people. The arteries in your penis are smaller than the arteries in your heart, so they can show damage first. So if you're experiencing some ED and you haven't had your heart checks, that might be something to pay attention to. It's also true with diabetes. So diabetes can damage nerves and blood vessels over time. It affects those pudendal nerves we talked about earlier that send signal from the brain to the penis. It can also damage the blood vessels that carry blood into those two chambers, the corpora cavernosa. So if you have diabetes and your erections have started to wax and wane, it's not random. It's just what diabetes can do in the body. Medications can also cause challenges too. Antidepressants, blood pressure meds, sometimes prostate medications, they can all affect the ability to achieve and maintain erections. Some medications kill your libido. Some of them mess with the blood flow. Some interfere with the nervous system. So if you've started a new medication and you suddenly stop getting erection, those two things might be connected. Let's just touch on testosterone really quick. Testosterone does not directly cause erections. But low testosterone can kill your sex drive. So if there is a loss of interest in sex or you're not getting aroused, and no arousal can mean there's no signal to the penis. So testosterone can be a culprit. It not always, but sometimes, because testosterone affects mood, energy, sense of vitality. So to put it frankly, low testosterone doesn't directly kill erections, but it does dampen desire. And desire is something that's going on in the brain, which can impact erections around the way. Okay. We're almost done. Okay, so now let's just touch on the pelvic floor a little bit. You might not realize that your pelvic floor plays a role in erection. So the pelvic floor is a group of muscles at the base of the pelvis. They support your bladder, your bowels, and the penis. So when those muscles contract, they help compress the veins at the base of your penis and push blood into the cock to keep it there. Those muscles also help with ejaculation and bladder control. So if your pelvic floor is too weak or too tight, it can disrupt things. And a lot of men hold tension in the pelvic floor without realizing it. So again, stress, anxiety, sitting all day, chronic tension, it can show up in those muscles. And when your pelvic floor is locked up, it can interfere with blood flow and make it harder to get or maintain an erection. On the flip side, though, if your pelvic floor is too weak, maybe from lack of use, from surgery or injury or whatever, it also can't help trap that blood into the penis effectively. So strengthening or relaxing the pelvic floor might help with ED. It is not a cure-all, but it is something to consider. Pelvic floor therapy might help with ED in some cases. And this ties back to the client I mentioned at the start of this episode who didn't know his anatomy. Because if you can't address a problem in a part of the body you don't even know exists, then what can you do? It might be worth exploring where you're at in terms of how your pelvic floor is currently sitting if you are experiencing some ED issues. So why does any of this matter? Why does any of this matter? Because when you stop getting hard and you don't understand why, it's easy to spiral. You start thinking you're broken. You assume it's just age or bad luck or just some irreversible decline. But when you understand the mechanic, that it's blood flow, that there are those arteries and nerves are sending signals, and nitric oxide is relaxing blood vessels, and the tunica albuginea is trapping blood, and your pelvic floor muscles are helping you to maintain pressure, and your brain and your nervous system are coordinating it all. That's a lot. It's a lot, but it's also a mystery to a lot of us. So knowing these things, even this very high level overview, gives you some context. It helps you to have a general understanding of what's operating under the hood. Understanding doesn't fix it overnight, but it does give you, again, some context, some color. Because again, you can't address things you don't understand. And some causes of ED are completely treatable. Some of them require retraining your body or your brain. Some need medical intervention. And sometimes the understanding shifts something inside of you. So this episode is not an invitation to deep dive into a lot of trying to figure it out again. This is just about understanding where you are and what you're working with. So that's the mechanics. What's happening in your body when you get hard, what can interfere with the process physiologically and psychologically. Next week, we're going to move into part 3 of the series, and we're going to talk about navigating conversations, how to actually talk about it with a partner, how to deal with the vulnerability, and how to reclaim your power by accepting the reality, but not making it an identity. Because understanding the emotions and the physiology is important, but it's also important to be able to navigate this experience with someone else. So I'll see you back here next week. Ciao.